Okay, this is a bit of an experiment using a handheld mic. It's just because when I have the ones that are on my head, I just spend half the talk fiddling with them, and they're always distracting. So if I forget I have a mic in my hand and move it to a place where it's not helpful, wave at me. And then it'll probably take me a while to work out what the hell's going on, but there you go. So, hello. Stand up. Okay, thank you. It's all right, you don't have to do a dance. So, sit down if everything you do is always perfect. Nobody? Oh, got a couple of takers over there. Okay, cool. Sit down if whenever you spot an improvement at work that you could make, you do make it. Got a few sitting down. Sit down if you are a software engineer and every time you spot improvements that you could make to your code, you make them. Okay, a few more. Is that the last one? Sit down if you wish that you improved things more often than you do. Okay, if you're still standing up, you can sit down. So that was partly just to wake you all up, because it's first thing in the morning. I do the same when it's the end of the day as well. It just wakes you up. But also, it illustrates a point that I want to make. So refactoring is something that often doesn't happen, even though we want it to. That's my point. And I teach refactoring skills all the time, and I tend to focus on the how and the why, but I don't often get to talk about the why not. And that's what this talk is about. I'm going to start by talking about what refactoring is. I'm also going to talk about what it isn't. I am going to talk about why it's desirable. I'm going to talk very briefly about how to do it. But then I'm going to talk about why it doesn't happen and how we can make it happen, or at least how we can make it more likely to happen. And the clue is in the title. The secret to all of that, I believe, is compassion. Okay, so what is refactoring? When we refactor code, this is Martin Fowler's definition. And this is the definition that I work with, and it's widely accepted. But this is how I define refactoring. That when we're refactoring code, what we're doing is we're making it easier to understand and cheaper to modify. So easier to understand means we're reducing the cognitive load. We're making it so that when we look at a page of code, we can fit it in our heads and make sense of it without having to do lots of scrolling. That's important. It's important for my colleagues, but it's also important for future me. Now, I'm a 53-year-old perimenopausal woman. I have no short-term memory, very little long-term memory. So I can never remember what I did yesterday, never mind 2 weeks ago or a month ago or 6 months ago. But even when I was young and full of energy and my memory still worked, it was still very easy for me to look at code that I wrote 2 weeks ago and go, what the hell? Can't remember what on earth that is about. So by making code easier to understand, I'm doing future me a favour, as well as all of my colleagues. And future me could definitely be me this afternoon. So that's making the code easier to understand, but I'm also making the code cheaper to modify. So, for instance, Dave talked about this yesterday, but well-factored code, quality code, is likely to be modular. And sometimes making your code more modular is a really useful thing to do. That's refactoring. And what you want, again, is to be able to fit the code in your head so that you can make it really, and not just make it fit it in your head, it wants to be modular. You want it to be easy to add new functionality, cheaper to modify, because modification is what we do. Code is all about change. You want to be able to change your software. Okay, so what isn't refactoring? Lots of things get mistaken for refactoring. Rewriting a whole system from scratch is probably not refactoring. Performance gains, they're a good idea, but they're probably not refactoring. And I'll tell you a secret. Sometimes when you refactor, you slightly impact the performance. And I say slightly. Now, the story that you may have come across yourself is when software engineers get a little bit obsessive about performance and about making things super efficient. So a software engineer may well look at a function and say, I can make that more efficient. And they fiddle about with it, and they turn 3 lines into 1 line. And now it's going to run 2 milliseconds faster, and it's a piece of code that only ever gets run once a week. Nobody will ever notice. It doesn't matter, but now nobody can read it. And actually, having code that you can read is more important than having code that is super duper efficient, particularly now that we have such powerful computers. Quite often, when you think you're making something more efficient, you are only shaving milliseconds off, and nobody will ever notice. Apart from your colleague who comes along and then spends a whole day trying to understand what the code does. You've lost a day worth of developer time, which is really valuable, and 2 milliseconds of time that nobody will ever notice. So I'm not saying that performance isn't important, but it's one of the things that Martin Fowler, again, talks about in his refactoring book, which the previous quote was from, and I highly recommend. Software engineers are notoriously bad at knowing how to make their systems performance. They're notoriously bad at knowing where the performance bottlenecks are just by looking at the code. So it's actually a really good idea to prioritize readability, prioritize having code that people can understand, and later down the line, run performance checks. And you will find performance bottlenecks in places that you never even thought of. And the code that you thought wasn't efficient, not a problem. Okay, so making performance gains is useful, but it's not refactoring. Improving the user experience, incredibly important, not refactoring. Adding new features, definitely not refactoring. And bug fixing, not refactoring. You might refactor while you fix bugs. You might refactor because you fixed a bug and you saw that this code could be easier to understand. It could be cheaper to modify. And that will make bugs less likely in the future, and it'll make it easier to fix this bug and fix future bugs. So you might refactor while you bug fix or because there was a bug, but bug fixing is not refactoring. Okay. So why is refactoring desirable? I mean, I hope that we can probably agree that it is anyway. And a lot of things that I've said have already hinted at it being desirable. But I'm going to put satisfaction up here as a really top reason for why refactoring is desirable. We've actually already covered this in the definition when we've said that refactoring is making your code easier to understand and cheaper to modify. If your code is easy to understand, that's satisfying. Making your code easier to understand is satisfying. Having code that's cheap to modify, making it cheaper to modify, is satisfying. It makes us feel good about doing a good job. So satisfaction is a good reason to refactor. This one's kind of the obvious one. If you refactor your code, you will have higher quality code, and you will have higher quality software products that are running off that code. So Dave described quality yesterday as being easy to change. I think that's what he said. More refactoring is more quality. Less refactoring, degraded quality. Ron Jeffries said, the less you refactor, the slower you get, and the less you want to refactor. So there's a negative spiral there, that refactoring gives you quality code, but poor quality code is harder to refactor, and we'll come on to that later, kind of can make you less likely to even want to refactor. Ron Jeffries also, and he's not the only one, also talks about the campsite principle. So this is the idea that if you're doing wild camping, then you will, when you arrive at the campsite, you want to make it clear and ready to camp. So the most obvious thing that you want is a clear spot to put your tent in that doesn't have rocks and twigs in it, because you don't want that thing rolling over in the night and suddenly it's incredibly uncomfortable because there's lots of rocks under you. So you clear a space, you make it tidy, then you camp, and then when you leave, you tidy up after yourself. So you tidy before and you tidy after. And when you do this with refactoring, so you can refactor before you add a major feature and you can refactor after. So you're tidying up and you're improving the quality. Okay, so how do we do it? There are lots of good practices that will help with refactoring and that you can do as you refactor. The first one is, I have actually got a clicker. But then, yeah, the two-hand thing, I'm just going to put that there. Right, okay. So refactor as you go. So if you're doing test-driven development, you may well have seen this cycle. So in test-driven development, you write a test, see it fail, make it pass, and then refactor. And ideally, this only takes a few minutes. You're writing very, very granular tests. You're writing very small amounts of code, and then you're refactoring. So you're refactoring all the time. It's built into what you do. So and even if you don't practice test-driven development, I would highly recommend this, that really every time you write a couple of lines of code, you look at them, you say, can I make that easier to understand and cheaper to modify? So you're constantly thinking about refactoring. So that's the first really useful principle. And then the next one is to refactor in small chunks. So when you're refactoring, just change a line of code or a couple of lines of code. Actually, I could do with putting these in a different order, but park that for a minute. Refactor in small chunks. The next one is really important. Make your code testable and tested before you start refactoring. So you want to know that your code is well covered by tests because you want to know that you haven't broken anything. So I said earlier that refactoring is not adding new features. Refactoring is not changing the functionality at all. Your code should still do the same things that it did after you refactor as the same things that it did before you refactored. So, therefore, that means that you can run your tests to make sure it's still doing the same things it did and to make sure that you haven't broken anything. So I don't think it's a good idea to refactor at all unless you first add tests and then keep those tests green. This is why I said kind of pause slightly after the first one, because what I want to be doing is making very small changes, small refactors, and then running the tests always. So what I don't want to do, and this is partly why I said the big rewrite is not refactoring, I don't want to pull everything apart. I don't want to have it lying in pieces on the floor. Because when that happens, I can't run the code, which means I can't run the tests. And nothing is working while everything's lying on the floor. So I want to make very small changes that result in code that can be run and tested. And I want to check that my tests are still green. The next principle is when you're choosing what to refactor the parts that have an impact. So refactor those areas of code that you often see that people have their hands on a regular basis. So yes, there may well be a 300-line function sitting at the back of your code base that makes you shudder when you look at it. But if you only looked at it because you opened the wrong file by accident, and nobody ever touches that area of code, and actually it's working and it's running quite happily in the background and nobody cares about it because it's just a little thing that just keeps going and nobody ever adds anything new to it, leave it alone. Very tempting, I know, but there are probably more important areas of the code base to prioritize first. So refactor the areas that have an impact. And that's pretty much all I'm going to say about how to refactor, because that's not what this talk is about. So this is my son Oscar when he was 8. Look at that. So sad. He's trying to do a really cool trick, but he can't because people are getting in the way. He's blocked. So I'm going to talk about refactoring blockers. And these are the blockers that I'm going to talk about. And I'll go through them one by one, so you don't have to absorb all of that all in one go. So the first one I'm calling external pressure. So this is pressure from maybe other people in the team, other people in the department, other people in the company. And this is pressure to do other things that are not refactoring. And the most obvious example is deadlines. You're in a rush. You have to meet a deadline. It's really important. This thing has to go live on this date. Nothing is as important as that. Refactoring goes on a back burner. Tests go on the back burner. We're just getting this thing out of the door. You haven't got time for refactoring. That people want to refactor, but they don't believe they have the time or the permission to refactor. So that's one of the big reasons why refactoring doesn't happen. And it is related to a lack of patience. So another thing that prevents refactoring from happening is a lack of patience. But actually, one of the big culprits here is ourselves. And I mean me. I do this. I'm terrible. I'm impulsive. I'm obsessive. I'm impatient. And quite often I've got a new thing I'm trying to build and I'm really excited about it. And I can see that really, it would be better if that was better factored. But I haven't got time for that. My own impatience prevents me from refactoring. Another big one is seeking perfection. Now, this might sound counterintuitive because surely if what I want is high quality, well-factored code, that's me seeking perfection. That's a good thing, isn't it? Surely that means that I do refactor. But the problem is that what happens is we think everything we do should be perfect. We come to events. People stand on stages and tell us how to do this job well. And we get all excited and we think that's how we're supposed to do it. We're supposed to do everything right. If we do this, and this, then everything will be brilliant and our code will be perfect. And then we go back to work and our code really isn't perfect and our systems really aren't perfect. And actually, that can be demotivating. Because we're seeking perfection, because we believe that everything should be brilliant. Everybody else, they've got amazing code bases and they do all the right things all the time and their code is beautiful. And look at our code. And actually that can be demotivating. It can stop us from making things better. So even if you start out with good intentions, all of the same flaws and imperfections can come back in again, and then you get fed up, and then you don't want to refactor. And then you feel guilt and shame and despair. None of these are motivating. None of these galvanize us to action, generally. I mean, they can, but generally they don't. And then what happens is we hide the imperfections. We don't talk about the fact that, you know what, when I was working on that feature just now, I was thinking, oh, God, I could make this so much better. but I feel so bad about it, and I don't want to admit that it was me that wrote that code in the first place. I'm just not going to mention it. So often the guilt, the shame, the despair means that we don't even talk about the imperfections. We pretend they're not there rather than addressing them. Okay, this is Oscar again. Look at his face at the end. Another thing that can trip us up is if we feel like we don't know what we're doing and we don't believe that we can make things better. It's twofold, this one. We don't believe that we can make things better. We don't trust our own ability to refactor, but we also don't trust our own opinions. So a lot of the time, unless you've been on the same team for a really long time, working on the same code base, and even if you have, there'll be areas of that code that were written by somebody else. But this is more likely to happen with people who are less experienced. You look at a piece of code and you think, I think this needs refactoring. I think it's problematic. I think it could be easier to understand and cheaper to modify. But maybe I just don't know. Maybe I just don't understand the intention of the person who wrote it. And maybe if I call it out and say, I think this needs refactoring, I'm going to expose myself and people are going to say, can't you see that this was written deliberately like this because of this? And who the hell are you? And so we don't say anything. We don't try to refactor it. We don't say that we think it should be refactored. Or maybe everybody agrees that it needs refactoring, but we don't believe that we have the skills to do it. And because of that lack of self-belief, we don't do it. Okay. Some of the people in the audience will understand why there's a duck here just now. So in November, I was at Yale London, and Holly Cummins did a talk about the importance of fun in the workplace. And she cited some research to say that ducks are the funniest animals. And I thought it was all getting a bit depressing. So that's just to lighten the mood. No other reason. Okay. Now this, no spears, no spikes. You've already seen my son, Oscar. Clearly, I'm a proud mum. And I also have a video of him saying, he was 4. He'd been to the school sports day, and they'd done an obstacle race. And we were asking him about it. We were saying, what, an obstacle race? How does that work? Is it like Indiana Jones? Is it like spears and spikes? And he was like, no. And we said, no, surely there must have been things coming at you. And he's like, no. And he just said, no spears, no spikes, just running and jumping, running and jumping. And there's just this really cute video of him saying, no spears, no spikes, just running and jumping, and doing this cute little movement with his hand. And I wanted to turn that into a video, but it's a family video. He's half dressed. There's absolute chaos and mess in the background. So it would be a really cute video, but it's not necessarily that great for public consumption. But this idea of no spears, no spikes, just running and jumping, running and jumping. So we get to just do our work without the obstacles, without the spears and the spikes, just running and jumping, running and jumping. And you could say, well, let's just remove the blockers, and let's just say it's the job of technical leaders to just remove the blockers, and then everything will be fine. But removing blockers isn't easy. And what we often suffer from is a lack of compassion. And that is the final blocker that I want to talk about. But I also think that it's the thing that can unlock everything else. A lack of compassion. So this is Felix and Oscar. That's Felix on the left, Oscar on the right. Felix is his big brother, my other son. And he's helping him. He's showing him compassion. So I think that we can use compassion to, if not make refactoring happen, at least create the conditions where it's more likely to happen. So we can help to facilitate it. So I'm going to talk about all of the things that I've already talked about, but now I'm going to talk about how we can use compassion to mitigate external pressure. Oh, look, there's a word how in the middle. That's not supposed to be there. Don't know how that got there. Never mind. We can use compassion to balance our impatience. We can use compassion to, instead of worrying about being perfect, to embrace imperfection. We can use compassion to help each other believe in ourselves, and also maybe create conditions where we can facilitate ourselves and each other to seek joy in what we do. G. Paul Hill talks about the well of geek joy, and I love this idea. I want more of that. Okay, so deadlines. They are the most obvious example of external pressure. We have to do it now, we have to do it as soon as possible. We don't have time to refactor. Now, the most obvious, there's a very simple solution to this, but simple doesn't mean easy. Doesn't mean easy at all. But it is simple, and it's ask for more time. Move the deadlines. The deadlines are often unrealistic. The deadlines are often arbitrary. The deadlines often don't really have much basis in real life at all. And actually, we do nearly always need more time, and deadlines can be questioned. And spending time buys time. So if we spend time on refactoring, it means that we can understand the code when we return to it. It means that we can modify it without having to disentangle everything. It means that we can find and fix bugs quickly. All of those things save us time, but they require some upfront refactoring investment. So in the short term, it feels like it's taking us time. In the long term, it saves us time. So what we want to do is ask for time. And that's where the compassion comes in, because we're not going to get it unless people are being compassionate, unless we are showing compassion to one another and understanding the constraints that we all face. And if we are encouraging compassion, then we're making it more likely that we can make those requests and that people will respond positively to them. And there's always more to do. We all have these never-ending to-do lists that whenever you get to the end of it, there's just a bunch more stuff that's been added to the end. So instead of saying we're going to have everything done by a particular date, instead what we can say, we'll just keep tackling things one at a time. Now, obviously, we need to prioritize as well, but we're just going to keep getting things done. And when we get to that date, we will have done what we did. We will have got done what we could have got done and what we were always going to have done, because promising to deliver things by a certain date and agreeing, yes, that's the deadline, we're committed to it, doesn't make the things happen, doesn't make them any more likely to happen. It just makes it more likely that we're going to be really stressed out and somebody's going to be annoyed with us for not having met that deadline. It also does make it more likely that we'll have worked ridiculously hard during that time period, and eventually we're going to burn out. And again, that is only ever a short-term investment. It doesn't pay off long-term. So if we can show compassion to each other, then that makes it easier to have those conversations about we will do as much as we are capable of doing, and when we reach the deadline, only then will we know how much we could have done. And yes, there are lots of techniques we can use to get better at guessing about that, but we'll never really know until we reach the deadline. And if instead we talk about the fact that we are all working hard, we're all doing the best job we can, and we will do what we can do, and we're probably going to need more time than we think. If there is compassion, then all of those conversations become easier. Because thinking takes time. We work in a knowledge industry. We use our brains to do our job. Our hands are only kind of peripheral. I mean, they're quite important, but you can do it without hands, but it's hard. But mostly, it's our brains that are doing the work. And thinking takes time. It's not something you can completely mechanize. And it's okay to ask for time. It's okay to say, you know what, I need to think about this. I need time and space to think, because that's actually important. And we shouldn't be embarrassed or ashamed to say, I need to think. And when we show each other compassion, then it gets easier to say, I need time to think. It gets easier to give each other time to think. So what about impatience? And I have cast this as mostly being an internal thing. So, other people get impatient, but we can get impatient about our own work that we do and then not produce the highest quality because we were impatiently trying to get to a particular point and we didn't take our time. Because actually this is something we do to ourselves. It's not just something that other people do to us. And compassion here is compassion for ourselves. It's forgiving ourselves. It's being able to look at a piece of work and say, you know what? I did that in a rush. You know what? I was focused on other things when I did that. I was not focused on doing the best quality job. And rather than beating myself up, I mean, particularly, I've been in this industry for 20 years. It's now my job to teach good coding skills to other people and has been for a while. I'm a consultant, so surely I, of all people, always refactor, always do everything in exactly the ways that I teach other people to do them. And I wish I could say, yes, I do, but I don't always. And so if I forgive myself for that, then it's going to be easier for me to then address it. It's going to be easier for me to be open and honest to the people that I'm working with and say, this needs refactoring. I want to do it now. I should have done it before. I didn't. Let's do it now. Help me do it. And if we are showing compassion to each other, then those conversations, and to ourselves, then those conversations get easier. And that is also related to the drive for perfection. So, as I said before, if you think everything should be perfect, you're going to quickly fall over the fact that everything isn't perfect, and pretty much never is. And then you're going to feel bad about it. You're going to feel the guilt, the shame, the despair. You're not going to want to own up to it. And I hate to break it to you, this has been an amazing event, but you're not going to go back to work and suddenly do everything perfectly and everything will be brilliant. Not going to happen. And so you have to prepare yourself for that now. And it's really helpful to embrace imperfection. And if you pay attention, so it can be, I've certainly fallen for this, where I've read the books and I've seen the talks and I've thought, oh, they always do everything amazingly and I don't, and I'm supposed to. And that's what they're saying. And they're not. So if you pay attention to what a lot of people say, Ron Jeffries, Martin Fowler, Kent Beck, G. Paul Hill, they talk about being fallible. The reason they talk about making things easier to understand is because they acknowledge that sometimes they don't manage to understand things. We're all fallible, and we have to allow for that fact. And I asked Ron Jeffries, who was one of the original signatories of the Agile Manifesto, very involved in extreme programming practices like test-driven development. I asked him whether he ever follows practices that he discourages, or whether he ever misses out steps that he encourages other people to take. And he said, there are things that I think are good, but that I don't always do. And things that I think are not so good that I sometimes do. In fact, he ended up writing a whole article about it. That's the link at the top. So it's okay. You're not perfect. You're not always going to write brilliant code, and there will be reasons why your code is not brilliant. So I like to talk about embracing imperfection. And I happen to be a published novelist. And one of the things that I often like to talk about when I talk about writing is I talk about the hunk of rock. So sculptors have an advantage that they always have raw material that they can start with. So they start with the hunk of rock and then they sculpt it to make it into something beautiful. But writers and software engineers don't have a hunk of rock. There is no raw material that we can start with and then sculpt. We have to generate our own raw material and then sculpt it. So when I talk about writing, I talk about writer's block. I say you have to create your hunk of rock. That's your first draft. It's going to be bad. It's supposed to be bad, is what I say. Embrace that imperfection. When you write your first draft, tell your inner critic to go take a jump. You don't want your inner critic in your head at that point. You're going to write something bad. Embrace that. It's okay. It's supposed to be bad. And then, when you've written the first draft, you've got it out, then you can look at it and go, oh my God, who wrote that? And it's fine. Now you can sculpt it. Now you can perfect it. Now you can make it elegant and beautiful and brilliant. But you can't without the raw material. And the analogy in coding is, if you think about the red-green refactor cycle, your first goal is to make the test pass. Chances are, at that point, your code is not great. That's your hunk of rock. That's your raw material. Now you can refactor. Now you can make it easy to understand and cheap to modify. But if you've got all of those things in your head at once when you start, that can stop you from getting anywhere. So it's okay to make things that aren't perfect, because what you can do is make them perfect afterwards. Or not, and probably they'll never be perfect, but you can improve them afterwards. And the irony is, the more you accept and handle bad code, the more likely you'll end up with good code. If you give yourself permission to create something bad, then you also give yourself the freedom to craft it into something good. This is refactoring, and it needs compassion for ourselves, for our colleagues. The more you accept your own limitations, the more likely you are to be able to break through those limitations. So, another way of tackling the potentially crippling expectation of perfection is to just make tiny improvements. The smaller, the better. Small changes mean less risk. And a slightly improved thing is safer than a thing that's been completely destroyed in service to a mythical future perfect thing. Now, this concept, many more much smaller steps, is G. Paul Hill's way of talking about this idea of focusing on tiny steps. And I'm going to say it again because this might be the most important thing I say in the whole talk. It really matters. You want to learn how to make tiny improvements. And G. Paul talks about every step is a movement from a ready state to another ready state, or maybe that's what Ron Jeffrey says. But anyway, I think G. Paul phrases it in a different way. But the idea is that each step takes you from green to green, and you want those steps to be as small as possible. Many more, much smaller steps. And this is a really useful principle in refactoring, in software development, in life. And the compassion comes into this because what we're saying is that we're expecting only small, realistic things from ourselves and from each other. And that is a compassionate way of thinking about things. And that brings us to self-belief. Let me just check the time. Okay. If we don't believe in ourselves, this is problematic. If we don't feel able to refactor because we don't trust our own skills, if we don't even trust our ability to recognize that code needs to be refactored, that's problematic. And this is not going to surprise you, but I'm going to say that if we show compassion to ourselves and each other, then we make it easier to have belief in ourselves. Now, this is a series of slides that appear in a lot of my talks. I call this the Wheel of Confusion. These are all colleagues of mine from when I worked at ThoughtWorks. That's me at the bottom, different hair. This represents a forum that exists within ThoughtWorks worldwide. As far as I know, it still exists. ThoughtWorks is a big organization. I mean, it's small compared to the really big ones, but it's big enough that there are thousands of engineers worldwide all thinking about software development, all chatting about it. And in this forum, there are lots of different topics all the time, always being discussed. And I can see one of my former colleagues in the audience who'll be able to verify this. Hello. There are so many different topics. Now, I made this slide a few years ago, so some of these might be out of date now, but I just looked at the forum one day, and these were all topics representing things that I don't really know anything about. And I looked at them, and you look at something like that, and you know, all these people all talking about all these things so confidently. They all know so much more than me. I just feel so stupid when I look at this thing. But you know what? Andy feels the same way. So Andy, too, is looking at all of the people talking about all of the things and thinking, oh, my God, they all know so much more than me. It's not just Andy. Anik is doing it, too. Ezra is feeling the same way. Georgia feels terrible. Ileana is really scared. John is like, what the hell is going on? Kirsty is also having a bad day. Now, I should explain that these all came from a work party where I went around with my camera, on my phone, and said to everybody, I want to take, is it okay if I take, and then I'm going to publish, 2 photos of you? One where you look really confident and happy, and one where you look confused. So these poor people, I was making them act on the spur of the moment, but they did a really good job. So that's Kirsty looking upset. Mitch, like, oh no. Rob is not feeling good. Scott is not happy. And we're back to me. So the point is that other people are also thinking these thoughts. So your colleagues who you don't want to admit that you think maybe this code needs refactoring, or who you think are all so much better at refactoring than you are, they are also worried. They might not be worried by exactly the same things as you, and that's the great thing about teams. We all have different strengths. But they're almost certainly worried, and if not all of them, then a lot of them will be having similar thoughts. And also, it's worth remembering that the reason the code needs refactoring is because whoever had their hands on it last, or even whoever wrote it, was not confident to refactor it because they weren't sure they knew what they were doing. And that might be why it needs refactoring in the first place, and that's okay. So MMMSS, which I should have said is what GPOR shortens it to, so many more much smaller steps, works here as well. Each tiny change you make to the code is making it easier to understand. So this thing about, oh, I can't refactor it because I don't understand it. You can use refactoring to understand it. So one of the most common refactoring techniques that I use and that I teach is called extract method. So Dave mentioned it yesterday. You have a giant piece of code that you can't possibly fit in your head, too much cognitive load. And so what you do is you extract parts of it out into smaller pieces of code that you give names to. That's a refactoring technique, but it's also a technique that you can use to understand code that you don't understand. You can be in the midst of a refactoring of code that you still don't understand, but you are gradually understanding by the efforts that you are making. You can use refactoring to understand code that's hard to understand. You don't have to start by understanding it. And in order to believe that you can make a difference, you need to show yourself compassion, and you need other people to show you compassion. But the last one I'm going to talk about is seeking joy. The joy of coding, the joy of doing a good job. So this is Oscar again. This time, nobody got in his way. He's happy. Everything is brilliant. And if we show kindness and compassion to ourselves and to each other, then we have more chance of acknowledging that software development can be fun. It can be satisfying. We can get a kick out of each small improvement. We can find ways of accessing the well of geek joy. And all of us can work on creating the conditions where knowledge work is acknowledged. And people don't feel like they have to ask permission to do a good job, to take time to think and to enjoy their work. And the irony is that people who enjoy their work are much more effective than those who don't. And we tend to think that if you enjoy something, it's not worth anything. But the opposite is true. So I'm incredibly lucky. I'm very privileged that I get to do this, and I actually don't get paid for this bit, but I get paid for other bits. It all works out. I get to do this, and it is my job. Now, that didn't happen by accident. This is a journey that I've been on. But part of that journey was working out what I enjoy and valuing it. Now, I'm a little bit unusual, I think, in that I just really like being on a stage. I enjoy performing. That's always been true. That's never not been true. I was Mary in the Nativity when I was 5. You know, I like being on a stage. And it used to be that I just thought, well, that's nothing to do with work. That is a completely separate thing. It's also not at all valuable. It's it is self-indulgent, but it's completely self-indulgent and nothing to do with what I do for a living. And there were other things I did as well that I didn't think were anything to do with work. Writing, for instance. So, as I mentioned, I wrote novels. Nothing to do with work. And I had a lot of skills that I did not value. I didn't think they were important. But I gradually found ways of incorporating them into my work. And at first, I was like, ooh, I kind of got away with this. I'm managing to do these things that I find fun at work, but they're not worth anything. And I should, not tell anybody, because I might get told off. But gradually I worked out that I could value these things. And it was okay to enjoy what I do. And actually, I was worth more and more impressive when I lent into the things that I enjoyed. And I deliberately tried to find ways of enjoying my job. And we can all do that. And what you enjoy will be completely different to what I enjoy. It doesn't matter. But the point is finding ways of making what you enjoy be part of what you do. And recognizing that if you enjoy it, that makes it valuable. We tend to think the opposite. If we enjoy it, it's not valuable. No, if you enjoy it, it is valuable. Seek joy. And then maybe we can make the world a better place. So by facilitating each other's joy, we're making the world a better place. We're looking after each other instead of turning on each other. And there are lots of really bad things happening in the world at the moment. People are having to flee. I mean, this has always been true, but it's definitely happening now. People are having to flee the place where they live because things are so terrible, and yet they're not able to find safe haven elsewhere. Trans people all over the world are being attacked, physically attacked. There are a lot of people who are facing a lot of difficulties. But compassion is something that we can do to make the world a better place, not just in the workplace. Okay, so to summarize, refactoring is about making your code easier to understand and cheaper to modify. It's best done continuously in tiny, low-risk steps that are testable. It's less likely in low-compassion environments where there are unreasonable deadlines, unrealistically high standards, feelings of guilt or shame, but it's more likely with compassion, and compassion can help us to give each other more time, to embrace imperfection, to focus on tiny improvements, to believe in ourselves, and to find ways of enjoying what we do. This is Felix on the left, my oldest son. And I'm going to do an extreme proud parent moment now and tell you that his girlfriend is going to have a baby in October and I'm going to be a grandma. Okay, hopefully Seb and Duke are here somewhere. I know they'll be very happy that I've put this slide up. So Socrates UK is happening next week. There's going to be a training day on Thursday, June the 1st, which is next Thursday, where I'm going to be running a workshop on adding tests to legacy code. And then there's an unconference, so complete open space event from the 2nd to the 4th, which is Friday to Sunday next week in the UK. You can still sign up for that if you're interested. This is me. I help teams to improve their software delivery. I deliver keynotes and workshops, loads of links that you can use to access me. The slides are shared in the Slack. And I also hosted a podcast for a year, 27 episodes, still up, interviews with a bunch of really interesting people. Relevant to this talk, I interviewed Emily about refactoring. So there's a whole episode devoted to refactoring. I interviewed Mary Williams on changing legacy systems, and I interviewed G. Paul Hill, which is how I met him, actually, on test-driven development. But there are 27 episodes, all really interesting, I would say that. If you have any questions or you want to talk about any of the things that I've raised, we're not going to do Q&A here, but you can come not down, over there. When the partitions go up, there will be an open space area over there where you can talk to me about things or just come and find me. Okay, thank you.